I stood in a black dress beside a closed casket I had not been allowed to open, telling myself that shock makes people behave strangely, and that my daughter-in-law's insistence on shielding me from horror was an act of mercy. Then my phone vibrated with a message that yanked the floor from under me. My son stated that he was alive, that the body in the coffin was not his, and that I should meet him the next afternoon at the abandoned Miller farm at exactly 3:00 p.m., alone. I felt the whole room tilt, neighbors murmuring condolences for an empty box, floral perfume cloying the air, organ music pouring like syrup over a lie. I slipped outside to answer, hands shaking as I typed, mind racing through years of habit and love. 42 years of teaching high school literature, 20 years of widowhood, and a lifetime of believing that I could tell the difference between grief and theater. I had tried to welcome Stephanie, my son's wife of 3 years. Despite the controlling glances and the way she seemed to place herself between him and everyone who truly cared about him. 2 weeks earlier, he had called sounding giddy about a real estate development opportunity in Florida and promised life-changing money. I had heard something forced in his laughter and warned him to be careful. He had insisted the plan was legitimate and that Stephanie, so good with numbers, had everything figured out. A week after that call, Stephanie had sobbed into the phone that a fiery car crash had left his body unrecognizable, and she would spare me the sight. The refusal to let me see my boy one last time had scraped against every fiber of my being. But grief makes cowards of certainty, so I had surrendered. Now the text smashed through my surrender. I walked back into the parlor wearing a mask, accepting sympathy I did not deserve to accept, letting the woman with the perfect makeup cling to my arm and praise my strength while I realized I had underestimated a performance crafted to steal my judgment. I did not confront her. If my son was hiding, there was a reason. The Miller farm had been our town's worst-kept teenage secret. 20 acres of overgrown pasture and a sagging farmhouse 15 miles out where high school boys pretended their dates were impressed by stars and silence. That night, I slept in ragged snatches, jumping at every noise, reconsidering every memory. I told myself the message could be fake, that hope can impersonate truth in the dark. Yet the text came from my son's number and named a place only he and I would remember. I drove the rutted road at 2:55 p.m., and when a figure stepped from behind the barn, walking with my boy's shoulders, I felt my chest loosen in a rush of faith. He hugged me so hard my knees wobbled. He apologized for the cruel theater and said he had needed to be sure I was safe first. From whom? I asked, and watched a haunted man replace the eager son I had heard on the phone 2 weeks earlier. He told me that Stephanie had not married him only for love. She had married him for access to something in our family she had quietly mapped. When my father died, he left me 40 acres of mountain land in Colorado that everyone considered worthless. I had never visited it, only paid taxes. Stephanie had arranged a survey in secret and learned about a natural gas reserve with a value whispered in millions. My name sat on the deed, but she had maneuvered a stack of documents under my hand a month earlier, claiming they were about life insurance and estate preparedness. What I had not read carefully enough allowed a transfer that placed the land in my son's name and then chained future rights so that, if he died, she alone would inherit. He described overhearing a phone call in which she calmly scheduled funeral logistics before his supposed death and realized there were hours, not days, between him and a finality he was not willing to accept. He had staged an empty casket with sandbags to buy time and begged me to help him expose what he called the people Stephanie worked for, criminals who had perfected a pattern of targeting older property owners with unrecognized assets and draining them with forged paperwork and staged catastrophes. I wanted to run to the police and hand over the terror. But a mother recognizes fear that is not melodrama, and his was the sound of someone who understood exactly how far these people would go. I promised we would play along just long enough to choke the trap with its own design. That evening, Stephanie texted asking me to come over to discuss my son's estate and a few documents she wanted my signature on. And I agreed, because predators relax when they think the herd is compliant. She laid papers across the kitchen table with a trembling sincerity that had won many scenes. I wore reading glasses and confusion, asked simple questions, knocked over a glass of water to buy seconds for photographs of the pages while she fetched towels, and watched a mask slip when I politely said a lawyer should look first. The air turned chill as she insisted that she was family and that delay would be expensive for taxes. My insistence on counsel cracked her composure, and I left with my purse and my posture intact, certain that she understood I had not surrendered. When I unlocked my front door, 3 men looked up from my lamps and furniture as if the house had switched owners. The oldest wore the kind of forgettable face that thrives in violence. He said they needed to clear up confusion about my son's business, and another produced a grainy photograph of my boy near the Miller farm taken that afternoon, making a game of my denial. They claimed my son owed $2.5 million to lenders who do not print brochures, because he had decided to play dead. They said they would have to collect from next of kin. And the third man named the Colorado land as a solution. Transfer the property and the debt would evaporate. Refuse, and they would extract their payment by other means and ensure my son would never trouble them again. They gave me until the following night and announced that Stephanie would bring papers. When the door closed, rage steadied my hands. I was a retired English teacher. Yes. But I had also spent 4 decades diffusing bullies who believed cruelty made them clever. I drove back roads to the farm to keep anyone from tailing me and told my son the timeline had shrunk to a day. He confessed how a set of private loans with glossy returns had begun as $10,000, grown to $25,000, then multiplied into an illusion of profit that had, in truth, been a funnel into a scheme. The returns had paid early participants with later money until the collapse left those who had borrowed from dangerous people owing principal plus punishment. He was not sure whether Stephanie had been foolish or calculating when she led him there. But the men in my living room were not uncertain about their methods. I decided that we would give them precisely what they thought they wanted while ensuring it poisoned them. At dawn, I drove into the city to the office of Marcus Chen, once a rebellious student in my senior English class who now ran one of the state's most respected criminal defense firms. He hugged me and teased me about Shakespeare, then listened as I laid out the entire chain-forged documents to steal mineral rights. A staged death, extortion at my own coffee table. He listed crimes: fraud, conspiracy, extortion, possibly kidnapping through coercion, and advised calling federal agents immediately. I told him I would not feed my son to prosecutors while the architects of the scheme disappeared, and asked whether we could hand the criminals a package that looked like surrender but functioned as a confession. He thought for a long moment, then smiled the way a student smiles when a theme finally snaps into focus. 3 hours later, I left with a briefcase of legal instruments that appeared to transfer my Colorado property into a new trust with Stephanie as trustee. Hidden in the dense fabric were automatic triggers. Acceptance of the trustee role constituted sworn acknowledgement of having participated in or benefited from any prior fraudulent attempts to obtain the property. It also imposed a duty to disclose those acts to federal authorities and granted standing for immediate federal jurisdiction upon signature. The language was not decorative. It was a net woven into every paragraph. The strategy was simple. Either they refused to sign and obtained nothing, or they signed and confessed while obligating themselves to cooperate against their own network. I went home and waited to be summoned. At exactly 7 p.m., Stephanie called in a voice stripped of her widow's tremolo and said she would bring papers in an hour. I told her my house felt heavy and asked to meet at the Riverside Diner, a public place that had always steadied me. The choice was not sentimental. On Tuesday nights, the sheriff ate meatloaf there. The local prosecutor picked at pie, and half the town's gossip committee held court 3 booths away. I wanted witnesses who understood what signatures mean. I arrived early and took the back corner booth with a clear view of the room. Sheriff Tom Bradley sat in his usual place reading reports between forkfuls, and I felt courage harden into plan. Stephanie arrived precisely on time with the man who had lounged in my late husband's chair the night before. She introduced him as a business partner, and he scanned the diner with professional caution that lingered a fraction too long on the sheriff. She slid a manila folder toward me, a sheaf of transfers and authorizations designed to separate me from everything my father had left. I set them aside, as if impressed, then produced Marcus's documents and explained that my attorney had prepared something more comprehensive to protect everyone's interests. The man lifted an eyebrow and named Marcus with the wary respect of a threat recognized. For the next 20 minutes they read, searching for traps in language that was itself a trap by virtue of being both accurate and obscuring. I explained, in the patient cadences of a teacher, that when millions and mineral rights are at stake, prudent drafters include protections against irregularities in the chain of title. That phrase made the man look up sharply. I elaborated about liens and fraudulent transfers as if this were a lecture on caution rather than a map to their confession. He wanted a lawyer to review the documents, but it was after 8 p.m. on a Tuesday, and real counsel who value bar cards do not sprint to rubber stamp high-value transfers in diners at night. I mentioned, with studied vagueness, that new quarterly reporting rules would change tax treatment for mineral rights after midnight, and that delay could freeze the process for months. It was nonsense with the tint of governance, and urgency is the favorite narcotic of greedy plans. They read for another 40 minutes while I answered questions in the exact tone I used with students who want to be reassured that the hard part is almost over. At last, they signed, and I excused myself, briefcase in hand, and walked to the sheriff's table. Quietly and quickly I explained that my son had faked his death because of threats, that criminals had attempted to coerce a transfer, that I possessed photographed forgeries and, now, signed documents that bound 2 perpetrators to admit their scheme and trigger federal oversight. The sheriff's face shifted from curiosity to a professional admiration edged with anger. He said what I had orchestrated was both clever and lawful. I told him there were more players and asked for 5 minutes to draw out a location for the handoff, so that an arrest would catch the full tree of accomplices rather than 2 branches. He gave me those minutes and a warning that if it went sideways, he would cut in fast. I joined my table again and asked what came next. The man said their legal team would process tonight and suggested a warehouse on Industrial Boulevard as the meeting point. They wanted me nowhere near it, insisted my signature was all that was needed, and told me to go home and rest. That suited me. I left, nodding to townspeople who took my exit for grief finally collapsing, and saw the sheriff stand and pay his check. In my car, I phoned my son, told him signatures were on paper and that he should not move from the farmhouse, then watched the sheriff on his phone coordinating with state partners and federal agents. I drove to a hill overlooking the warehouse district where I could observe without intruding. Unmarked cars softened into shadows around exits. Tactical vests moved like chess pieces. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus confirming that the moment those signatures dried, federal jurisdiction attached to the matter by voluntary admission and fiduciary acceptance, language he clearly enjoyed as much as I did. At 10:47 p.m., 3 cars rolled to the site, the first carrying Stephanie and the man, the second carrying 2 enforcers from my living room, the third bearing faces I did not recognize and therefore suspected were of higher rank. 12 minutes later, floodlights made noon out of night, and a measured voice announced federal presence and demanded visible hands. There was no bravado. 6 people walked out, blinking and small. Suddenly, ordinary. It is strange how quickly menace shrinks when spotlights replace curtains. The sheriff called as the last suspect was loaded into a car and said it was over. They had not only the people before us, but evidence of at least a dozen similar frauds in multiple states, along with the paper skeletons I had photographed and the signatures that confessed by function. He told me my son could come home. I sat very still and let something inside unclench. The drive back felt softer. And when I parked, I realized an old fear had transmuted into a new muscle. I had not simply survived the long day. I had discovered the steadiness that had always lived in me. On my porch, my son waited in the glow of the lamp, alive and near and safe enough that my legs weakened. He asked if it was truly over, and I told him, yes, the arrests were real, the property safe, and his own safety restored. We went inside, and I made coffee like an ordinary mother at an ordinary hour, while he stared at the steam rising from his favorite mug and weighed what trust means after betrayal. He asked when I realized Stephanie had targeted him specifically, and I confessed that certainty did not arrive until her grief became too perfect and her paperwork too swift. She had likely researched our family before a first date, he said. And I agreed, because con games start long before a signature. He felt foolish and used, and I placed my hand over his and told him that loving someone who counterfeits warmth does not make the person who loved them stupid. It proves that person's heart still chooses faith. I reminded him that even I had lived decades beside a husband I believed I fully knew. We discussed how to trust again, and I told him that learning to trust begins with learning to trust one's own questions, verify numbers. Slow down urgency. Notice when a story requires secrecy and isolates you from your people. I told him not to let fear build fences too high for companionship. He smiled, a small new thing, and teased me that I had turned into a strategist when required. I reminded him that years of guiding teenagers through Shakespeare had been secret training for decoding and disarming melodrama. Morning brought the administrative weight of justice. We gave statements. We cataloged documents. The sheriff's office and federal agents traced phone numbers to shell companies. And the paper photos I had snapped in a kitchen under a toppled glass of water became lines of proof added to server logs and bank transfers. The Colorado land remained in a protective trust that neither of us would treat as a lottery, nor as a temptation. In the following days, the town's murmur changed pitch. People who had once waved at me at the library now stopped me to share stories of a cousin who had signed something they did not understand, or a neighbor pressured by a charismatic advisor. I began to see how common the anatomy of predation is: isolate, rush, flatter, frighten, obscure, and close. A week later, a prosecutor's letter summarized charges that stacked like books: fraud, extortion, conspiracy, racketeering, and predicate acts reaching across several states, with evidence connecting the network to a string of elderly victims whose mineral rights or quiet properties had been converted into someone else's yacht money. An early estimate of recovered assets crossed $40 million. A number that made my small kitchen feel like a courtroom had been briefly hosted by my coffee pot. Through all of it, My son moved differently. The boy, eager to please, had become a man who read every page twice and asked follow-up questions when Charm tried to play accountant. He apologized often for having dragged me into danger, and I reminded him that my motherhood had never been about preventing every scrape. It had been about helping him walk through consequences toward a better way. When sleep failed me, I drove to the diner and watched ordinary life restore balance, a couple splitting pie, the sheriff arguing gently with his doctor about salt, teenagers practicing bravery with extra ketchup. I found myself wanting to keep doing what the long night had demanded: protect people who did not know they were being auditioned for victimhood. I called Marcus and asked how a retired teacher could help without law school. He laughed and said most prosecutors would love a volunteer who could read fine print and train seniors how to spot the pattern before it bit. We built a small workshop at the library where I volunteered. Nothing fancy, just a table, coffee, and a whiteboard where I wrote phrases like "slow is safe" and "show it to someone who loves you." We rehearsed assertive lines for people unused to resisting urgency. We walked through checklists, never alone, never rushed, never ashamed to ask questions, and I watched eyes widen as attendees recognized their own near misses. The sheriff stopped by one Saturday to tell the group that pausing can be the bravest act in a room engineered to remove pauses. Later, he pulled me aside to say that Stephanie had started talking to federal agents in the calculus of self-preservation, and her statements had opened additional doors. She had admitted to reading about my father's property years earlier, to commissioning that secret survey, and to feeling certain she could orchestrate a legal transfer that would render me grateful and fogged. She had not, however, calculated how teaching trains a mind to anticipate plagiarism, rehearsal, and manipulation. I do not celebrate another woman's fall. I grieve the harm she chose and the people she decided were furniture in her ambition. But I am grateful that the truth did not depend on my gullibility. My son moved back home while figuring out next steps. We negotiated space like adults who loved each other in a new way. He took long walks at dawn, came back with ideas about graduate school or a job at the county's emergency management office, and left me notes that said thank you in 100 small ways: gas in the car, a repaired hinge, a favorite pastry. We learned to speak in precise sentences about money, risk, and trust. He opened a separate bank account and gave me a copy of his will with a frankness that would have embarrassed him a year earlier. We visited the Colorado land together at last, standing on a windy ridge and listening to a place that had quietly held generations. We promised not to treat it as a slot machine. We spoke with ethical advisors about responsible leasing that did not scar the world we wanted to leave behind. As life normalized, not all memories did. Sometimes at 2:00 a.m. I woke certain that footsteps moved downstairs, and I would walk the dark corridors of my own home with a flashlight. Not in terror, but in acknowledgement that safety is a practice. At 3 weeks, I received another letter, this one longer, detailing how the case would likely unfold over many months and how my testimony and the documents designed by Marcus formed a spine for multiple prosecutions. The letter noted the scope of their operation and the intention to seek restitution for victims. I sat at the kitchen table and let tears come, not of grief, but of release. Then drove to the cemetery where an empty service had once been held, and left flowers as a private joke with fate. On the ride home, my phone chimed with a message from a woman in a neighboring town who had come to the library workshop. She wanted to tell me that she had paused a high-pressure sales pitch that afternoon, made a phone call to her daughter, and decided not to sign. She wrote that she had felt silly at first, then strong. That message felt as important as any letterhead. That night, my son and I ate dinner in the small backyard under a string of bulb lights he had installed on a Saturday, and we talked about how betrayal, once named, becomes a teacher rather than a tyrant. He asked if I ever missed the classroom. I told him that I loved the library, loved the workshops, and loved the way the town had begun to tell stories in which the old woman is not the victim, but the strategist. He said I had always been that woman. I just had not needed to prove it before. The next season passed in ordinary pieces rain on a porch. A broken washing machine belt. A casserole left by a neighbor who finally knew where to place her gratitude. An invitation from a regional task force asking whether I would consult on outreach. I said yes because helping people is the work of my life, whether through sonnets or scams. When anxiety visits, it still brings images: 3 men lounging in a dead man's chair, a closed casket, a forged signature sliding across a kitchen table. But the images now share space with others: a sheriff's steady nod, a lawyer's sly smile at elegant clauses, a diner's fluorescent hum where bad plans went to die, and a hill above a warehouse where floodlights made criminals look very small. My son began volunteering with a veterans group that helps people find work that does not pretend to be easy or glamorous, but is decent and pays actual bills. He liked the way real solutions require neither lying nor urgency. He apologized less and laughed more. Sometimes I catch him looking at the porch light as if confirming that home is not just a place, but a promise. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I opened the folder that held copies of everything and wrote in my own hand across the inside cover, "Slow down. Ask someone, read twice, sign once, and never in fear." I slipped a second note inside that said, "If you are reading this because you are scared, you are not stupid. Call someone who loves you, then call someone who knows the law." The habit of a teacher never dies. We leave notes for our future students, even when those students might be ourselves. The letter from the federal prosecutor arrived at 3 weeks and confirmed what the sheriff had said in the diner: 24 felonies across multiple states. Assets in the range of $40 million identified for recovery, and a pattern of abuse dismantled because a performance met a script it could not read. There would be trials, pleas, and years of process. Justice takes its own calendar and is always slower than harm. But slow, I have learned, is safe. My life moved back into its gentle orbit. I returned to shelving books, leading a senior book club that found metaphors in detective novels, and hosting a monthly clinic on scam awareness with the sheriff's office. The clinic's best moment each month is the same: the silence that follows someone realizing that the knot in their stomach is a respectable messenger and not an inconvenience to be shushed. We end every session with a small practice. Everyone takes a pen and writes one sentence they will use when pressure visits. Mine is always the same: I do not make decisions today. I will review this with my family and my attorney tomorrow. It is not a magic spell, but it opens a door back to oxygen. The last piece of this story belongs not to the arrests or even to the recovery, but to the ordinary triumphs that replace spectacle. My son and I stood in the backyard one evening and agreed that the land in Colorado would be treated as an inheritance of responsibility. We drafted a letter to future beneficiaries stating that wealth is not a prize, but a practice, and that any benefit must be weighed against what we owe to the land itself and to the people who stood before us. He asked whether I resented the years I spent undervalued, underestimated, or dismissed as merely patient. I told him patience is not passivity, it is a stance. It allows you to notice when a story bends towards you with a demand that you hurry. He laughed and said he wished he had learned that sooner. I reminded him that most of us learn the hard way, and that learning late is still learning. A few months after the arrests, the prosecutor invited me to watch a hearing. I sat at the back of a courtroom and watched people who had once felt enormous shrink to human size in front of a judge who asked simple questions about truth and consequence. I did not feel triumphant. I felt relieved for every family that would not have to sit in a living room with uninvited men explaining that debt had replaced a son. On the way out, a woman in the hallway stopped me and said she had seen me at the library. She squeezed my hands and told me that her mother had been approached with a similar scheme and had used one line from the workshop to buy time that saved a farm. I walked to my car and cried. Not for the criminals, not for the lost months, but for the quiet victories we do not put in headlines. That night, at my kitchen table, I wrote the ending I would want if this were a book I was teaching. I wrote that the funeral had been fake and the resurrection real. Not because a body rose, but because a family did. I wrote that sometimes being underestimated is not an insult but a resource, because people who cannot see your strength will reveal their plans in front of you. I wrote that love is not blindness. It is a decision to remain open even after harm, with better boundaries and brighter light. I wrote that the best traps are built from truth and time. Then I closed the folder and went to bed knowing that tomorrow I would return to the library. Pour coffee and welcome a room of people who needed proof that they were not alone and not foolish for having almost believed a lie. If you have followed this far, know this: your instincts are not noisy nuisances. They are instruments. Tune them, trust them, share them with someone who will listen and mirror back your good sense. Our town is quieter now. The diner still serves meatloaf. The sheriff still argues about salt. The book club still misreads clues and then laughs when the reveal shows up on page 2. My son sometimes sits on the porch at dusk and watches the light come on. He says it feels like permission to rest. I tell him that is what home is meant to feel like. And I sit beside him, no longer underestimating myself, no longer letting urgency pretend to be wisdom. Grateful that the life I have left will be spent teaching the same lesson I taught in classrooms and learned anew when the casket was empty. Stories save us when we learn to read them. If this story resonated with you, tap like to help it reach others. Share it with someone who needs a reminder to slow down and trust their instincts. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories about finding courage in ordinary days. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what lesson you are taking with you.